we wanted to demonstrate that Stanley, he talked a lot about these pictures being pot boilers, and some of them were, admittedly. The quality isn't great, but I would say in general they weren't. And he clearly enjoyed painting the natural world. He loved nature and he loved his Cookham environment. And that is something we've set out to prove in the exhibition. And also, we wanted to demonstrate how a lot of these pictures fed into his narrative work, his visionary work, the things that, the most important work to him. And so the two were symbiotic, if you like. I don't know if you've all been to see the exhibition, but we wanted to, rather than having a swathe of green fields and landscapes, we wanted to separate it up so that people can really learn something and take something away. So you'll see that there are various sections in it about Stanley's beginnings, something about his use of metal and dirt, the sacred and profane, and also redemption, how he found solace through painting the natural world. And we're going to cover a few of those things in this talk. Got loads of pictures for you, so I hope you all take delight in what we're going to have a look at. And in some ways, this is really an ideal exhibition. Due to the constraints in the gallery, there's not a huge amount of space. We can't fit everything in. Cost elements, a lot of these are from north of England, and the costs for us are prohibitive. And also post-COVID, there are very few registrars operating in museums at the moment, so it's really hard getting loans. So actually, of all our exhibitions, this has been a real struggle getting it together. Huge amount of work on a registraral level. So I'm really pleased with what we've got. Quick word about the title, which isn't just a, throwaway delight in nature. It actually comes from a critic who was writing for the Scotsman in 1936, and that was a time when Stanley was doing a lot of this landscape and still life work. And he wrote in the paper, "Spencer paints landscape as they, the pre-Raphaelites, did, with the same prodigious delight in all the facts of nature for their own sake. He loves to paint nettles and grasses, leaf by leaf, blade by blade, as they did. He loves it all too much to leave anything out." And I wanted to start off by showing you this work by Burne-Jones, Wise and Foolish Virgins, from 1859. And this is in pen and ink. And for me, the technique reminds me quite a lot of Stanley, this very intricate use of the pen, creating these minute details. And as the critic said, leaf by leaf, blade by blade, the amazing detail here of the flora, the nettles, even the feathers on the peacock, and equally, that aside, just the mood of it is very Stanley. It's incredibly mysterious, and as we'll look a bit later, his love of these strange spaces, looking through gaps in windows. And undoubtedly he was looking at Burne-Jones when he was thinking about both his landscape work and his figurative work. This is in Tate by Hermogenes Calderon, 1856. And again, this is another work which for me sums up Stanley, and is something, this sort of thing is absolutely the sort of thing that he'd have been looking at. And again, this minute detail of nature, this aching mood, the gaps through the fence, it's quintessential Stanley in many ways. And also the symbolism of the plants. And so obviously this is all about lost love, and this lady can hear through the fence two lovers whispering, and she's desperately upset because clearly she had been enamored of the man. And so the withered iris is all about lost love, and the ivy symbolizing eternal love. And again, Stanley also used plants in a similarly symbolic way. So getting back to Stanley, and this Fairy Goblins in High Corn, that's the start of the exhibition, where we set out to demonstrate that from a very early age, Stanley was enraptured by the world around him. And it's not, you know, he was young at this point. It's not particularly technically accomplished. You know, the rabbit bolting down the rabbit hole is a little bit clumsy, but it's still a very fanciful image. And his use of the pen and ink is pretty accomplished, I'd say, at that age. I mean, it's a very difficult medium to use. And I've put here this little Victorian book illustration. Sorry. Oh, sorry, everyone. Just to demonstrate the sort of thing he'd been looking at. You know, everyone talks a lot about his love of Brer Rabbit. And this book is imaginatively called The Boy and the Goblin. And clearly he'd been looking at books like this, as well as being inspired by the Cookham landscape. And at this early age, he describes how he got inspiration sitting amongst the hollyhocks and the runner beans. And this really gives a flavour of the man and the artist that was to come. So this 1914, skipping on 10 or so years, this view of Cookham, this is Stanley's first known landscape, pure landscape in oil. Obviously he had used landscape as a background in earlier narrative paintings, but this is his first pure landscape. And I think you'll agree that the colour of this vivid green, the bright blues, again owes a lot to his pre-Raphaelite predecessors, and this real richness. And he's become extremely accomplished at representing light. And this beautiful dappling of light on the trees is a spectacular feature of this painting. And sort of unlike his later work, a lot of the paint plane is very flattened. So later on he gets this much more sort of detailed rhythm and texture in the paint. And you can see that he's very influenced here by, I hate to say it, Cézanne, which he said he wasn't influenced by the modern masters, but clearly he had been looking at Cézanne and Gauguin and other contemporary artists. And actually, in 1937, he wrote, I don't know what persuaded me to paint this. You know, I really don't like this picture, but at the time, he loved it and was incredibly pleased with it. And again, it's indicative of the very contradictory things that Stanley had said. So it's very hard unpicking what he says, and one can never quite take him at face value. Now, I just wanted to tell you a little bit, mention Gilbert, who I think is quite important in Stanley's development as a landscape artist. Now, this is by Gilbert, it's in Tate, and was painted the same year as Stanley's 1914 Cookham landscape. And I think you'll agree they're pretty similar in style. And at that date, Stanley really thought Gilbert was the better landscape artist and convinced himself, he was quite nervous about his brother's talent and refused almost to engage in practicing landscape art because he felt his brother was much, much better. And he wrote about his competitious brother and that famous visit to Dorset when post-war in 1920. And Stanley's riven with angst about how good his brother is. And I think this might give us some idea as to why he's slightly reticent about landscapes. I just wanted to show you this, which I found in Clouds Hill, the house of Thomas of Arabia, owned by the National Trust. And this is by Gilbert, stuck into the wall of the house. And he stayed there in 1925. So I just thought it was rather nice to include that. So this is Stanley at his best, I think, 1920, when he goes off on this expedition to Dorset with Gilbert and Henry Lamb. And at this time he did 9 paintings on plein air, out in the open. And Gilbert said to him, gosh, we've got this beautiful rolling landscape, and yet you choose to paint the sort of race mill machinery. And as we'll see, and as we know, Stanley just loved the things that people would find ugly or brutal. He found the beauty in those things. And I think just the sheer symphony of the colour, the play on light of the metal and the brick is so stunningly beautiful. and really looks forward to what he's going to be doing later on in life. Metal was considered also by a lot of his contemporaries as the fabric of war, as a very ugly thing. And so, the likes of Nash and Nevinson painted sort of mangled pieces of metal, whereas, for Stanley it was a much more beautiful thing to be celebrated. And, we've got to remember that at this date, in 1920, he wasn't able to paint narrative work because he was suffering from war depression. And looking at drawings like this that he did of Macedonia with these beautiful sort of crevasses riven into the mountainous landscape there, it looks like he's having rather a nice time and enjoying the landscape and the mules, and we forget the deeply traumatic, upsetting experience he had. And I think that trip to Dorset really helped him to come to terms with what he had seen there. I just wanted to show you this, which I'd have loved to have had in the exhibition, which is this crucifixion, which is in Aberdeen, which he painted sort of around 1920, I think. And again, so around the time of the mill. And again, it shows how he'd remembered those beautiful fissures in the rock in Macedonia and used them later. And actually, I just wanted to read this out to you. The quote from Stanley: "I wanted to bring the geography of the mountain into one state of being, an expression with some great human happening," the crucifixion. "Looking broadside at the mountain, one sees 3 ravines fingering their way upwards and making huge dock-leaf shapes. The crosses have been erected in the bottoms of the ravines. The terminal ends of the transverse bars are over the parapet sides. The Virgin has slithered down the escarpment side to the base of the cross." Only Stanley would come up with that. But again, I just wanted to point out how all these features of landscape feed themselves into these religious and visionary works. So landscape is essential for his artistic vision. And whilst we're figuratively in Macedonia, I wanted to point out, as I'm sure you all know, that Stanley rarely painted abroad. We all know Cookham really was the quintessence of his being, and so he really found his greatest artistic inspiration there. That said, he did make some trips abroad, and in 1922 he went off to Yugoslavia with the Carline family of artists, including his first wife Hilda, with Richard and George and Sydney. And I think they'd all been inspired by looking through National Geographic and had decided it was a wonderful place to go and practice their landscape work. And equally, Stanley wanted to go back there after his active service. And they stopped off in Vienna for 5 days. And on their return, they took the boat back from Trieste and went overland through Munich and Cologne. And I'm so interested in this, and I'd love to have some time to look at exactly what they saw in Germany, because I think I can just imagine some of the pictures that they would have seen that would have been really important to him. Anyway, that's off topic. But I think the Carlines were really important because they loved painting landscapes. So all through, this picture of Sarajevo and Ragusa were all painted with them. And so this was clearly an important expedition in terms of getting some level of confidence, I think, having felt overwhelmed by his brother. Later on, in the early 1930s, he went off to Switzerland with Edward Beddington Behrens and Patricia Priest. And I think he felt slightly bullied going there. Beddington Behrens was quite an overpowering patron. And I think he was clearly a kind man, and he thought Stanley would really enjoy the Swiss way of being and the national costume. And, I think this is a particularly accomplished work of him, Skittle Alley. Stanley stayed in this little hotel in the background. And he also did this beautiful alpine landscape, which I think is technically brilliant. But he didn't really find his mojo in Switzerland, it had to be said. And I just want to add in good old Sarah Tubb, which looks slightly too luminous, for which apologies. And he came back from Switzerland and did this picture for Edward Beddington Barons. And this is Stanley coming back, and this is where his heart is. And I think we've always got to remember that. And later on, he went off to China, obviously, but his travel was really minimal. Now, I wanted to show this because I'd have loved to have had this in the exhibition, actually. This is from Lady Margaret Hall, but we could only, their generosity, we couldn't ask them for everything. And this was done in 1923, so skipping back a few years. And this was also bought by Linda Greer, who had bought the beautiful painting we've got in the exhibition of the Gardens in the Pound. And I wanted to put this in because just to make the point that Stanley did not distinguish between still life and landscape work. For many artists, they're two separate skills, but for Stanley, he they were one and the same thing for him. And again, this demonstrates his love of Cézanne, or lack of it. I mean, he clearly loved Cézanne, and also the influence of Gertler, and also all these lectures at the Slade on people like Chardin, the Dutch old masters, and getting back to this Stanley veneration of things of the everyday, a bag of apples. This absolutely sums that up. So again, we talked earlier about the 1914 work, the landscape in Cookham, and this very sort of plain way of using paint, really like the sort of early Italian Renaissance artists like Giotto, these beautiful swathes of colour. And for me, this is very much in that idiom. And then later on, his style changes, and the peonies and poppies, both from 1938, he begins to use the canvas and the oil in a very different way, much more detailed. And we get back to that quote, delight in nature, every blade, every leaf. And I'd have loved to have had these pictures in the exhibition, but sadly, from Newark and Nottingham, and sadly these regional museums are so pushed for staff at the moment, they literally just couldn't get the loans processed. Later on, snowdrops, and I'm just showing a few of these so-called still lifes, which is, again, a bit later, 1955. And stylistically, this really reminds me of Christ preaching. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner and the way those little clumps of flowers are painted, this is absolutely like that, and it's the same sort of date. And this was painted for Cash Martineau. And Stanley proudly wrote about this, and he described it as his first potboiler that year. And again, I think this idea of him calling it a potboiler is really disingenuous, because he then goes on to write this paragraph, which I shall read out to you. There was only one small clump of snowdrops, but they are fearfully pleased with themselves. You can imagine them discussing it. He's come right to where we are, and he's looking very hard at us. He's gone indoors now. No, he is coming out with a camp stool. There's something up. He has tied a jumper round his head, for warmth, I suppose. Goodness now, a sort of school satchel, and out comes a furry sack which opens at the front, and now a hot water bottle of all things. He has put in that sack, and now he has put himself in the sack, and he is painting. I knew there was something about us. And what sort of man describes his painting as a potboiler and then goes on to imagine what the snowdrops are discussing? I think it's the most extraordinary, naive and egocentric passage in any of his diaries. So again, in the exhibition, we've got this beautiful bluebells and rhododendrons from the British Council, 1945. And again, this really represents how much Stanley enjoyed looking at the natural world. And this was painted in Glasgow in his landlady's garden. And at that time, he was doing the shipbuilding on the Clyde series. And he took time out and found solace in the natural world. And this was a form of mental chewing gum for him. He loved it. He wanted to go out and paint these things. And the same can be said of this, which I really wanted to get for the show as well. from the same year and was painted in a greenhouse in Glasgow known as Kibble Palace in Glasgow Botanical Gardens. And actually this, we tried very hard to get this. It's owned by Barclays Bank, and unfortunately, Jess Staley, it's sort of at the same time it was his whole Jeffrey Epstein thing erupted, so he wasn't taking calls about paintings, unfortunately. The trials and tribulations of getting loans. So I wanted to include this, which for me sums up, the skill at still life painting, skill at landscape, these exquisitely drawn sunflowers with the drooping heads and these beautifully curled petals, and how his study of the natural world fed itself into his extraordinary visionary work. This is 1937. It was bought by Wilfred Evell, who was so amazing at that time, buying stuff that was too difficult for anyone else to buy. And as we all know, this is about heaven being composed of all-embracing love, sexuality embracing everything, including dogs and plants. And actually, probably if Stanley painted that now, he'd probably be cancelled. But actually, what is interesting, later on, he told Wilfred Evell that he divided the picture into two. And he said, inside the wall are those who have achieved grace by the acceptance of his doctrine, and outside are those who have yet to be converted to polyamory. And again, we'll look a bit later about this device of using a wall and landscape as a narrative division to help us understand what he's trying to portray. So skipping back to 1924 and back to Cookham and the beginnings of his landscape practice and merging that with his visionary expression, Resurrection in Cookham Churchyard, his absolute masterpiece in my opinion. And this, for me, is incredibly sophisticated, the way he sets figures in the landscape and again uses the landscape to tell a story. And also, so we've got, you all know this picture so well. You've got Stanley in the corner here in a tomb that looks a bit like a book, which I think is so appropriate for him, given his love of books. And this love, all these beautiful still life details around Henry Schlesser coming up out of his grave, and beautiful roses over the porch of Cookham Church. And again, the roses are symbolic of purity and love, and the ivy, again, Christ's sacrifice, everlasting life. And so all these things are fed into the narrative. And again, in the background, you have the River Thames, this passage into the afterlife. We all know how important the river was to his spiritual vision. And with all these figures in the boat, with the souls being carried to heaven. And here's a lovely detail of God with his arms hanging over a tombstone with a figure holding babies. And some people have suggested this is Christ. Others have suggested it's Hilda. And I think probably all of those things, but I think most likely he's probably been looking at figures of Christian charity holding babies. Perhaps a mixture of all those things, but again, I just wanted to show this beautiful detail of how he's painted the roses over the porch. Again, another picture we've got in the exhibition, and just to typify how important Cookham Churchyard was to him, this holy suburb of heaven. And he wrote in Salonika in 1917 from the war, "I will go for a walk through Cookham Churchyard. I will walk along the path which runs under the hedge. I do so and pause to look at a tombstone which rises out of the midst of a small privet hedge which grows over the grave and is railed round with iron railings. A little to the right is a simple mound guarded at either end by two small firs, both are upright and elliptical in shape. I return to our house and I put it on paper." And obviously it's not about this picture, but it really demonstrates how he remembered every single detail, this extraordinary photographic memory that he had, and obviously how important the churchyard was to him. And again, we've got this in the exhibition, which is this beautifully illustrated letter to Desmond Chute, which again he wrote a year earlier in 1916 from Tweedledown, just before he went off to Macedonia. And in it he writes, he's aching to go to the bottom of the garden and look over the low wall across to the back lane school. And it just really shows us how detailed his memory is. And you can see he's even labelled here all the trees in the garden, the William pear tree, the laburnum, the apple tree with giant apples in brackets, which is such a beautiful thing, actually, in some ways more interesting than some of the finished works. So Stanley comes back from war and goes to Berkeley, and as we know, he does that, the huge monumental series of murals, but he wanted the chapel to be in Cookham, and all he wants to do is get back to Cookham. He's aching for Cookham to get his artistic mojo back on track. And in 1929, he goes back for a holiday and meets Patricia Preece. And he describes how she awakens all these sexual Cookham feelings in him. And as we know, that these feelings of sexuality and religious sustenance and the beauty of Cookham, this tripartite sort of synergy, all come together for him. And for me, this picture really embodies that synergy between Patricia and Cookham and his sexual desires and Cookham. And they're all encapsulated in this picture. I mean, it sounds extraordinary, really, to some people. But for me, this tortured hand and this rather sexy nape of her neck, which he's clearly enjoyed painting with the necklace that he had given her on her neck, which chime with the colours of the wild flowers on Cockmarsh. And for me, this painting really sums up his sexual obsession. And he lavished her with gifts, and which he could ill afford. So here she's wearing that necklace. And I just wanted to include this picture of Cockmarsh from a different perspective. So clearly it was a place which had huge meaning for him. So the same year, he painted Patricia in the garden, and you can see her sitting here in an outfit which he clearly bought from Switzerland, with peonies in the background. And this is in the garden of Lindworth. So, Patricia in a sort of natural setting becomes a consistent feature. We all know what happened. And for me, in some of these earlier works with Patricia in the garden, this lusciousness, this promise of fertility, of life, of growth and nature. And this, by stark contrast, is after everything has fallen apart. And this is painted from his studio, from Lindworth, which he had made out to Patricia. And he's going to be chucked out quite soon, in a couple of months' time. And actually, I find this painting incredibly interesting, the sort of wanton way the daffodils are thrown into the bowl. And I don't know if any of you have read John Berger's book, Ways of Seeing, and that seminal book from the 70s about the study of art history. And in it, there's a painting by Van Gogh of crows in a field, and you look at it and think, gosh, what a beautiful scene of Provence. And he then writes a paragraph and says, well, how would it change your view of this if I told you he painted this the day before he died? And you think, oh gosh, yes, the symbolism of the crows. And for me, this picture's a bit like that. You look at it and think, oh yes, lovely narcissi. But actually, there's a real rawness to it, the stark, wintry light and the sort of wanton way in which they're thrown in the bowl. And I find it in this, the flapping of the curtains is in a sort of very distracted way. I find it quite a soulful, moving picture. And by contrast, this is incredibly positive, but for me it sums up, again, the real difficulties that Stanley was having at that time. It was painted the same year as the Narcissi, and we know he moved to Adelaide Road, and this painting was bought by Malcolm MacDonald, the Labour MP, and he ended up paying for Stanley's rent in Adelaide Road. And so for me, this really symbolises this, move forward. And although it's a very positive image, it's also a rather sad image in many ways. Malcolm MacDonald, by the way, is a really interesting person. He was the son of Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, and he was an amazing collector. And he was a diplomat and had a huge collection of Chinese porcelain. But he did this great study of the works that he liked to collect. And for him, the key thing was beauty. Beauty, beauty, beauty. This was the key thing for him. So I think it's very appropriate that he should have bought this work by Stanley because it is exceptionally beautiful. So getting back to his return from Berkeley and finding sustenance in Cookham, I love this picture, which is in Dundee and which is of the lawn of the Ferry Hotel. And he really takes delight in everything about the Cookham the landscape, and I just think every detail of this is so lovely, from the geraniums to the dahlias on the tablecloth. And the view from Cookham Bridge is painted the same year, and you can see the lovely way the light is rippling through the water in very much the same way as that picture. But for me, the real Stanley aspect of this picture is the way he's painted these lovely upturned napkins, the way they've been folded. And for me, that really reminds me of his study of the tents in Macedonia. And he loves these cone shapes, and for me, he's a bit like a painterly Barbara Hepworth in some ways. So while she was studying space in sculptural forms, he's looking at them in a very painterly way. So here's another highlight from our exhibition. Again, Lady Margaret Hall, who've been so generous to us. And this is a real celebration of Cookham and a modest suburban garden, but Stanley is taking real delight in every detail there. We had wanted to get this version from Leeds, which I thought was quite an important one to have because of the iron railings. And in the catalogue, I talk a little bit about iron railings, which Stanley loves. And at that time, Clough Williams Ellis, the sort of cultural commentator and architect and poet, had spoken about the scourge of iron railings in Britain, the way everything had been divided up. But Stanley really loved them and felt that these sort of dividing areas but made gardens more magical. They were cosy, and he thought that in their enclosing, they made these spaces sort of rather more open to mysterious or divine happenings. Which is rather sweet, I think. And this was already evident from a very early age. So this is from 1910, Girls in a Beehive. And this is his earliest surviving oil, actually, in his first subject picture. And again, the back of the picture is covered by this iron railing, which separates two worlds. So you've got the two girls here, one of them being Dot Worcester, the butcher's daughter, who he absolutely adored. And Stanley described this picture, describing it as a fusion of his desires, the place, the girls, the religious atmosphere. So there you have it, all those things tied up in this picture. But so you've got the girls with their beehive. And I don't know the significance of the beehive, and there probably is none. Some art historians have said that it might be something to do with industry, but I think that's probably absolute rubbish. But you can just about make out the outline of Christ with his crook just on the other side of that railing. So again, it's a separation of our world and the religious world, which I think he's done to beautiful effect, actually. And again, this lovely way of painting flowers in a much more plainer, blocky way than he does later. Now, I just wanted to touch briefly on something that I talked about a little bit in the catalogue, which is about how village and suburban landscapes had changed post-war. So this is an edition from Homes and Gardens from the 1930s. And you can see that there was this move away from the necessity of using gardens as vegetable patches and as a utilitarian means to having a garden as a sort of decorative area. So Stanley's clearly celebrating all that. And obviously new species of plants were coming. And I think some of the patrons in Cookham were clearly celebrating these varieties that they had and wanted Stanley to paint them. And I think this phenomenon had come about a bit earlier, sort of in the 1890s. This is by an artist called Helen Allingham. This is in the British Museum. And I think Stanley is really continuing her legacy, because in the 1890s, with the development of rail links and transport, poets and artists and authors were travelling out to the countryside. They had a better means of exploring the countryside and delighting in the natural world and in nature. And Helen Allingham really summed up this new desire to engage with the natural world. And I think Stanley is a continuation of that tradition that started at the end of the Victorian era. It was a democratisation of the land, if you like. Now I wanted to touch briefly upon a little section of the exhibition about boundaries and walls and space, which I think is a really important part of his work. And I'd have loved to have had this Zachariah and Elizabeth in our show, but sadly Tate couldn't lend anything. And again, I don't want to overdo the Barbara Hepworth illusions, but this beautiful curved marble wall, well, it looks like marble, is such a modern, brave thing to do, separating these two worlds of the seen and the unseen, and this little girl looking over and seeing what is happening with this miraculous annunciation to Elizabeth, and the way he's used it to separate the narrative in a very clever way, set in the landscape of Cookham, and it's extremely sophisticated. Sorry. And again, neighbours. We have neighbours instead, our own beautiful painting, which again sums up this mystic separation of spaces. And Stanley talked a lot about his cousin's garden next door to Fernley, and just with childlike wonder, if you like, describing it as sort of elusive space, something he didn't quite understand, and he considered them rather swell, and it was very different. And I spoke a little bit in the catalogue about how this separation of space was to Stanley, and he equated it with emotional feelings. And so talking about Hilda, he describes her feeling as being akin to behind a wall, and his over-the-wallish feeling should he come to learn more about her. So walls and the division of space are something that's incredibly important to him and help his narrative symbolically and literally. The Cultivator, I think, is such a highlight of the show. I absolutely love it. And it really sums up Spencer's love of dirt and the discarded, and going back to the Mildare Western, he picks out this swathe of metal, and here he's found this discarded cultivator and has revelled in the beautiful red colour set against the grass. And he painted it at Garsington when he was visiting Otterline Morrell with his brother Gilbert. And I think this is a real treat, and we're so lucky to have this in the exhibition, along with the dustbin, which also typifies Spencer's love. I mean, which other artist would show someone chucking away daffodils onto a compost heap? And we've had a bit of a discussion when we were hanging. As you all know, he used his drawing from the Chayton Windus Almanac to work up this painting in an oil. And it was, in the almanac, it's the month of September, but she's clearly throwing away daffodils. So, obviously there was a bit of artistic license there. But again, you've got this incredibly brave sheet of corrugated metal sticking up, which really dominates the picture space. And again, this sort of over the wall, this very mysterious world with these windows, these little mirrors into another world which we can't see, and this rather eerie tree with the barren branches, which again suggests it must be autumn, but why is she chucking away daffodils? And actually, to me, there's an artist called Algernon Newton who really exemplifies this very quiet, eerie mood. And I'm sure Stanley had been looking at his work. Now, this is another picture, The Dustman from 1934, which is at the Lang, which I'd have loved to have had in the show. And again, it fuses, this love of landscape with the narrative vision, if you like. And again, I'm going to read to you something that Stanley wrote in 1932 about this picture, so a couple of years before he painted it. I am so enamoured of the dustman that I wanted him to be transported to heaven while in the execution of his duty. So I got a big sort of wife to pick him up in her arms, while children in a state of ecstasy hold up towards him an empty jam tin, a teapot, and a bit of cabbage stalk with a few limp leaves attached to it. Cookham people will say, "We have seen strange things today." And indeed they would have done. So rubbish became part of, this was all about the last day, the second coming of Christ, and only Stanley could have put, limp cabbage leaves in a vision of the Last Judgment. And this painting was rejected by the RA and led to his resignation. So I think it's a marvellous irony, really, that they then went on to acquire the dustbin, which we have in the exhibition. But I think this painting is just beautiful. And again, this exquisite detail, again, of the railings, the topiary, the detail of the cabbage, and the picket fence and the rocks. I mean, it's all exquisitely painted. So sadly, we have that with us, this picture with us no longer, the scarecrow, which is a great shame, again from 1934. And again, most artists would look at this exquisite field and choose to ignore the rather extraordinary shape rendered by the scarecrow. Whereas Stanley has really made it into something incredibly beautiful. And you've got these beautiful sweet peas around the broken fence. So there's this really interesting dialectic between beauty and the discarded, which creates an unease in some ways, but it's a very worthwhile and successful unease, if you like. And what I've been trying to work out what these are. So at the end, if anyone has any ideas, they look like sort of discarded pony jumps or something, I'm not sure. My next slide is appalling, I'm afraid. It's very hard to find a photograph of this. So this is the crucifixion, which he painted the same year. So he used that outline of the scarecrow to feed in to this religious narrative image, again typifying how the two fed off each other, these two practices fed off each other. This is in a private collection, which is why there are no good photographs available. Again, this is the Goose Run in Cookham, which is incredibly technically accomplished. Again, how any artist could sort of decide to paint this mishmash of discarded corrugated iron, broken wood, but with those little, again, it's all about balance, and those little bits of blossom in the middle lift it, and it becomes something rather beautiful, I think, and the sheer technical accomplishment of that. And I haven't talked about this sort of formal analysis of his pictures in this talk, but if you look at all his paintings, the balance between for example, sky and field and detail and lack of detail. It's incredible the way he creates the perfect picture. Which again is the case here, Boat Builder's Yard from 1936, which again for me is a very moderate, well-moderated picture, because you have this incredibly surreal view of goldfish in a tank in the foreground. It's rather sort of sparse detail, and the band of rocks and greenery, and then the boats in the background and the water. And these sort of strata of textures and colour create an incredibly visually harmonious image. So this might seem slightly surprising, but I just wanted to show you this because whilst he painted this the same year as he painted Boat Builder's Yard, and sometimes I find it quite hard reconciling the two. How could one go from one to the other? And actually, I can quite see why he did. I think, this dispassionate gaze, he looks at everything with exactly the same detail. There's no hierarchy of form. Everything is represented, whether it is ugly or not. And so I think that's how he got there. Every detail has been painted, however uncomfortable that is. And I think certainly, that trip through Germany on the way back from Yugoslavia was very important in that respect. Oh, this is totally off topic, but I did want to include it. I don't know if you've been to the Francis Bacon exhibition, but there's this picture there of Bacon's lover, George Dyer, crouching. And I hadn't seen this picture before, and I just thought the similarities with the leg of mutton nude were so profound that I felt compelled to include it and to encourage you to see the Francis Bacon exhibition. But equally, to show how different artists, Spencer is never negative. So everything is incredibly warm, inclusive, and there's no irony, there's no satire. Whereas Bacon is completely, is a nihilist. And so the contrast between the two couldn't have been more acute. I wanted to end with these couple of pictures which he painted in Northern Ireland, which I guess constitute as more travel. And the foreshore from 1952, I must say, came to us very late on. And looking at the picture, I thought, gosh, this is really lovely. But nothing prepared me for quite how beautiful it was in real life. And no illustration can do this picture justice. So I'd really urge you to go and have a look at it in the gallery. I mean, the way the rocks and the mud are painted and the different textures, it is just exquisite. I wanted to end with this other picture, also from Northern Ireland. He found Northern Ireland really inspiring. This is Merville Garden Village near Belfast from 1951. And again, I'd have loved to have had this, which again, this was pure leisure time for him. He went to go and visit his brother, and yet he still found time to paint the natural world. And again, you've got this beautiful balance of the discarded, this rather tatty-looking greenhouse, this garden building, and the shattered glass. Again, with this lovely sort of visual rhythm, which typifies all his work, in my opinion. And that is all. So thank you for listening.